Before there was a United States of America, there was this land, and on this land, for thousands of years, lived hundreds of nations, not tribes, nations, with governments, with laws, with diplomacy, with trade, with languages, with cultures so sophisticated that European explorers who first encountered them wrote home in astonishment at what they had found. These were not primitive peoples living in ignorance. These were civilizations. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whose democratic structure directly influenced the framers of the American Constitution, the Cherokee Nation, who developed their own written alphabet, their own newspaper, their own constitutional government, the Lakota Sioux, whose military strategy was sophisticated enough to defeat the United States Army in open battle, the Comanche, whose horsemanship and tactical brilliance made them the most feared military force on the southern plains. These nations had something the arriving Europeans wanted: land. And so, beginning in 1778, and continuing for more than a century, the United States government sat down with these nations and made agreements, treaties, more than 500 of them. Every single treaty signed under the full authority of the United States government. Every single treaty presented to native nations as a permanent agreement, a binding promise, the word of a nation. And of those 500 plus treaties, the United States broke every single one. Not most of them, not the majority. Every single one. This is that story. The year is 1778. The United States of America is 2 years old. It is fighting for its survival against the British Empire, and it needs allies. The Continental Congress turns to the Delaware Nation, one of the oldest and most respected native nations on the eastern seaboard. They sit down together, and they make an agreement. The Treaty of Fort Pitt, September 17th, 1778. The first treaty ever signed between the United States government and a native nation. The terms are specific. The Delaware Nation will allow American troops safe passage through their territory. In return, the United States promises permanent friendship, promises to protect Delaware lands, promises that the Delaware people will always have their homeland. The ink was barely dry. Before the violations began, American settlers moved onto Delaware land. The government did not stop them. Delaware people were attacked. The government did not protect them. In 1782, 4 years after the treaty was signed, American militia surrounded a group of Christian Delaware at a mission called Gnadenhutten. These Delaware had converted to Christianity. They were pacifists. They were unarmed. They were explicitly protected by the treaty the United States had signed 4 years earlier. The militia tied them, put them in groups, and killed them. 96 people, men, women, children, killed by the country that had promised them permanent friendship and permanent protection. The first treaty, the first betrayal. There would be 499 more. What happened at Gnadenhutten was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not the action of rogue elements acting against official policy. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat with almost mechanical consistency for the next 100 years. The pattern worked like this. The United States needed something land, resources, a corridor. Safe passage, a buffer zone. The United States approached. The relevant native nation sat down at a table, made promises, signed a treaty. The treaty was ratified by the United States Senate, given the full weight of federal law, presented to the native nation as permanent and binding. Settlers arrived. Onto the land the treaty had promised would remain native. Onto the territory the United States had just formally guaranteed. The native nation protested, appealed to the treaty, pointed to the specific language, the specific promises, the specific boundaries agreed upon. The United States government either ignored the protests, sent troops to enforce the settlers' presence, rather than remove them, or sat down with the native nation again and proposed a new treaty that took more land, that moved the boundaries, that reduced what the previous treaty had promised to protect. Treaty, settlement, violation, new treaty, repeated more than 500 times. Different nations, different land, different specific promises, the same result, every single time. Of all the betrayals, and there were hundreds, none was more deliberate, none was more documented, none revealed more completely the gap between what the United States said and what it did than what happened to the Cherokee Nation. In 1838, the Cherokee were not a nation that had resisted American civilization. They had embraced it deliberately, strategically, completely. By the 1820s, the Cherokee Nation in Georgia had a written constitution modeled on the American Constitution, an elected government, a Supreme Court, a free press, their own written language, developed by a man named Sequoyah, in which their newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, was printed. They owned farms, built schools, ran businesses. They had done everything. They had been told. Integration required. And they had treaties, multiple treaties, going back decades, all of them guaranteeing their right to remain on the land of their ancestors. In Georgia, in 1829, gold was discovered on Cherokee land. Within months, the state of Georgia passed laws abolishing the Cherokee government, seizing Cherokee land, removing Cherokee rights. The Cherokee Nation took their case to the United States Supreme Court, and they won. In 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that Georgia had no authority over the Cherokee Nation, that the treaties were valid, that Cherokee sovereignty was legally protected. President Andrew Jackson looked at the Supreme Court ruling and said, according to historical accounts, words to the effect of, "The court has made its decision, now let them enforce it." He sent the army instead. In the winter of 1838, United States soldiers rounded up approximately 16,000 Cherokee people, forced them from their homes, their farms, their churches, their schools, everything they had built, and marched them west, more than 1,000 miles. In winter, with inadequate food, inadequate clothing, no shelter, they called it, in the Cherokee language, Nana Dal Tsuni, the trail where they cried. We call it the Trail of Tears. Between 4,000 and 8,000 Cherokee died on that march, died on land they were crossing. To get away from land, the Supreme Court of the United States, had ruled they had the legal right to keep. They had the treaties. They had the Supreme Court. They had the law. None of it mattered, because the United States wanted the land and took it, just as it always had, just as it always would. In 1868, the United States government signed the Fort Laramie Treaty with the Lakota Sioux Nation. The treaty was specific. The Black Hills, Pahasapa in the Lakota language, the heart of everything that is, were guaranteed to the Lakota permanently, forever. The exact language of the treaty said, "No person shall ever be permitted to pass over, settle upon, or reside in this territory. No person, ever." The United States Senate ratified it. President Ulysses Grant signed it. It was the law. 6 years later, in 1874, General George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills against the treaty, against the law, against the explicit permanent guarantee the United States had made 6 years earlier, and Custer found gold. Within a year, thousands of miners had flooded into the Black Hills. The United States government did not remove them, did not enforce the treaty, did not honor the permanent guarantee. Instead, the government offered to buy the Black Hills from the Lakota. The Lakota refused. The Black Hills were not for sale. The Black Hills were sacred. The Black Hills were theirs, guaranteed by a treaty. The United States itself had signed. The government sent a commission to negotiate. The commission failed. The Lakota would not sell what was already theirs. So the United States changed its approach. It stopped pretending to negotiate. In 1876, the army was sent to force the Lakota from the Black Hills by military action. What followed was the Great Sioux War, a war fought by native people, not to conquer, but to keep what a legal treaty had guaranteed they already owned. At the Battle of Little Bighorn, June 25, 1876, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, under the leadership of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, annihilated the 7th Cavalry. Custer and 268 of his men died on that battlefield. It was the most significant native military victory in American history. It was also temporary. The United States sent more soldiers than the Lakota could fight, more soldiers than any native nation could have fought. By 1877, the Black Hills had been seized, despite the treaty, despite the law, despite the Supreme Court, despite everything. The Black Hills were taken. The Lakota moved. The gold was mined. In 1980, more than 100 years later, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the taking of the Black Hills had been unconstitutional, that the treaty had been valid, that the Lakota were owed compensation. The court awarded $102 million. The Lakota refused it. They did not want money. They wanted the Black Hills. That money, with interest, now sits in a federal account, worth more than $1 billion. The Lakota have never touched it, because the Black Hills are not for sale. They were never for sale. A treaty said so. The United States signed it, and then took the land anyway. Not every betrayal involved gold. Not every betrayal involved land that someone wanted, for the resources beneath it. Some betrayals were simply about the United States wanting native people gone. Sand Creek. Colorado Territory. November 29, 1864, Chief Black Kettle of the Cheyenne had spent years trying to maintain peace. He had traveled to Washington, met with President Lincoln, been given an American flag, and told that as long as he flew it, he and his people would be protected. He had been told to bring his people to Sand Creek, that they would be safe there, that they were under the protection of Fort Lyon. He trusted this. He brought his people to Sand Creek, approximately 700 people, mostly women, children, and elderly. The young men were away hunting. On the morning of November 29th, Colonel John Chivington arrived at Sand Creek with 700 soldiers. Black Kettle raised the American flag, the flag Lincoln had given him, the flag that was supposed to mean protection. Then he raised a white flag. Chivington ordered the attack anyway. What followed lasted several hours. Soldiers killed between 150 and 500 Cheyenne. The exact number was never established because the soldiers mutilated the bodies to the point where counting was difficult. The congressional investigation that followed documented what the soldiers had done in language so specific it cannot be repeated here. Chivington was never criminally charged. He was forced to resign his military commission. He later ran for political office. Black Kettle survived Sand Creek. He spent the next 4 years still trying to make peace, still trying to trust, still flying the American flag he had been given. In 1868, 4 years after Sand Creek, George Armstrong Custer attacked Black Kettle's camp on the Washita River at dawn. Without warning, Black Kettle was killed. His wife was killed. He had spent his entire adult life trying to find a peaceful way for his people to exist alongside the United States. The United States killed him anyway. Twice they had attacked his camp. Twice he had survived the first. He did not survive the second. He died still trying to trust a nation that had never deserved his trust. I want to take a moment to explain something important. The breaking of these treaties was not lawless chaos. It was structured. It was legal. It was done through Congress, through the courts, through official policy. The United States did not simply ignore its treaties with native nations. It built a legal architecture that made the betrayal official. In 1823, the Supreme Court established what it called the doctrine of discovery, the legal principle that European discovery of land gave Europeans, and by extension the United States, superior title to that land over the people who had lived on it for thousands of years. This doctrine is still on the books. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which gave the President legal authority to negotiate the removal of native nations from their ancestral lands east of the Mississippi. In 1871, Congress passed legislation ending the treaty-making process entirely. No more treaties, not because existing treaties would be honored, but because the government no longer wanted to go through the formality of making promises it had no intention of keeping. In 1887, the Dawes Act, which broke up collectively owned tribal land into individual allotments, and then declared that all land not allotted, the surplus, was available for non-native settlement through the Dawes Act. Native nations lost approximately 90 million acres in a single piece of legislation, legally, officially, with full congressional authority. This is important to understand. The betrayal of Native Americans was not committed by rogue actors. It was not the result of breakdown in an otherwise functioning system. It was the system operating as designed, producing the results it intended. The treaties were never meant to be permanent. They were instruments of a larger strategy to manage the pace of native displacement. While the conditions for permanent removal were being established, every treaty was a delay tactic. Every promise was provisional. Every guarantee lasted exactly as long as the United States did not want what it had guaranteed. That is not a system that failed. That is a system that worked exactly as it was designed to work. Every treaty was a delay tactic. Every promise was provisional. Every guarantee lasted exactly as long as the United States did not want what it had guaranteed. That is not a system that failed. That is a system that worked exactly as it was designed to work. December 29, 1890. The ghost dance movement had spread across the plains. It was a spiritual movement. A prophet named Wovoka had received a vision that if native people performed the ghost dance, the ancestors would return, the buffalo would return, the land would be restored, and the settlers would be swallowed by the earth. It was the movement of a people who had lost everything, looking for a miracle, because every human option had been exhausted. The United States government saw it as a threat. Sitting Bull, the great Hunkpapa Lakota leader, the man who had led the resistance at Little Big Horn, was arrested on December 15, 1890. During the arrest, he was shot and killed. His followers fled. A group of approximately 350 Mini-Conju Lakota, under Chief Bigfoot, began moving toward the Pine Ridge Reservation. They were intercepted by the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment. On December 28th, they were escorted to a camp at Wounded Knee Creek. The following morning, December 29th, the soldiers began disarming the Lakota. A shot was fired. Nobody knows who fired it. Nobody has ever established with certainty what happened in those first seconds. What happened in the seconds after is documented. The soldiers opened fire with rifles, with 4 Hotchkiss mountain guns, artillery positioned on the surrounding hills, and aimed into the camp below. When it was over, between 250 and 300 Lakota were dead, including Bigfoot, including women, including children. The temperature that day was below freezing. The bodies froze where they fell. They were buried in a mass grave. 20 United States soldiers received the Medal of Honor for their actions at Wounded Knee. The medals have never been revoked. Wounded Knee was the last major military massacre of Native Americans by the United States Army. It was also the end of what historians call the Indian Wars, not because peace had been made, not because justice had arrived, not because the treaties had finally been honored, but because there was no one left to fight. The nations had been broken. The land had been taken. The buffalo, 60 million of them, the foundation of Plains life, had been hunted to near extinction specifically as a strategy to destroy the nations that depended on them. The work was done. What had taken thousands of years to build had been systematically dismantled in less than a century. through 500 treaties, every one of them broken, every one of them a lie. The military war ended at Wounded Knee, but the betrayal did not end. It simply changed its form. In the early 20th century, the United States government implemented a new strategy. If native nations could not be destroyed militarily, they could be destroyed culturally. Beginning in the 1870s and continuing until the 1970s, Native American children were taken from their families, forcibly, sometimes with the cooperation of local authorities, sometimes against the explicit resistance of parents who were imprisoned for trying to keep their children. They were sent to boarding schools, government-run, church-run. The explicit stated purpose of these schools, in the words of their founder, Richard Henry Pratt, was to kill the Indian and save the man. At these schools, children were forbidden to speak their languages, forbidden to practice their religions, forbidden to wear their clothes, forbidden to use their names, given English names, Christian names, names that belonged to someone else. Children who spoke their language were beaten. Children who practiced their religion were punished. Children who tried to run home were caught and brought back. Thousands of children died at these schools from disease, from abuse, from despair. In 2021, ground-penetrating radar at the site of the Kamloops Indian Residential School in Canada found the remains of 215 children. Similar searches at American schools are ongoing. The last American Indian boarding school operating under this specific assimilation mandate did not close until 1973. 1973, not 1873. Within the lifetime of people alive today. This is not ancient history. This is recent. This is documented. This is within living memory. Most Americans do not know. The treaties are still law. They were never repealed. They were violated. They were ignored. They were worked around through congressional legislation and Supreme Court decisions that redefined what they meant, but they were never formally voided. And in the last several decades, native nations have been using those treaties in court and winning. In 2020, the Supreme Court ruled in McGirt versus Oklahoma that a large portion of eastern Oklahoma remained Native American territory under an 1833 treaty. The state of Oklahoma had been treating that land as state territory for more than a century. The Supreme Court said, "The treaty says otherwise. The treaty still stands." In 2016, the Standing Rock Sioux led a massive protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was being built through treaty-protected land. Water protectors, as they called themselves, from hundreds of native nations, came to Standing Rock, along with supporters from around the world. They were met with militarized police, water cannons in freezing temperatures, rubber bullets, tear gas, mass arrests. The pipeline was built, but something had changed. The world was watching. In a way it had not watched for more than a century. Native voices, through social media, through journalism, through the specific visibility that the 21st century allows, were being heard, not fully, not sufficiently, not in ways that have yet produced the accountability that 500 broken treaties require, but heard in a way that Sitting Bull and Chief Black Kettle and the 16,000 Cherokee who walked the Trail of Tears were never heard. I want to end this story, not with a massacre, not with a broken treaty, not with a government document signed in bad faith. I want to end it with this. They are still here, despite 500 broken treaties, despite the Trail of Tears, despite Sand Creek, despite Wounded Knee, despite the boarding schools, despite every policy designed specifically to eliminate them, physically, culturally, linguistically, spiritually. They are still here. There are 574 federally recognized native nations in the United States today. Native languages, many of them nearly lost, are being revitalized, taught in schools, spoken by children who would not have been allowed to speak them 50 years ago. Native artists, native writers, native politicians, native lawyers, using the very legal system that was built to dispossess them, to reclaim what the treaties promised. The Lakota Nation still refuses the $1 billion the United States offered for the illegal taking of the Black Hills, because the Black Hills are not for sale. They were never for sale. The treaty said so. And the Lakota, after 150 years, after everything, still believe in the treaty, even though the United States never did. That is not naivety. That is something that does not have a simple English word for it. In Lakota, there is a concept, mitakuya oyasing. All are related. We are all connected. The belief that the land, the people, the animals, the water, the sky, are all one living thing. That belief, 500 treaties tried to destroy it. It survived. They survived. And that survival, against the most sustained, most documented, most legally sanctioned betrayal in American history, is one of the most extraordinary stories the human race has ever produced. Trust is the most valuable thing a human being can give, and the most dangerous thing to give to the wrong nation.